Welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by opednews.com, available on Pacifica Radio Network, Progressive Radio Network, iTunes, Stitcher, at opednews.com/podcasts. And my guest for this interview, I have two guests. The one is Carol Gilligan, and the other is Naomi Snider. They've written a book together, Why Does Patriarchy Persist? Carol Gilligan is a writer, activist, new NYU professor, and the author of In a Different Voice, one of the most influential feminist books of all time. Naomi Snider is a research fellow at NYU and founder of NYU's Radical Listening Project. Welcome both of you to the show.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Did I also check, Naomi, that you're an attorney too?
Former attorney.
Former attorney.
Currently training to become a psychoanalyst, but
okay.
Yeah, I was an attorney.
Okay, so let's start over with a really basic question. What is patriarchy?
Oh, that's easy. Patriarchy is a system that's built on two things. One is a gender binary, which is either you're a man or you're a woman. Either something is masculine or feminine. You know, it's like real men don't eat quiche. Quiche is a feminine food. This is a woman's car. That's a man's car. Pink is a woman's color. Blue is a man. It's that either or of masculine, feminine, and then a hierarchy, a gender hierarchy, that whatever is considered masculine is elevated and regarded as, in a sense, more important, you know, superior, more valued, more privileged. So if you ever find yourself, it doesn't matter what it's called, in a system, in an order of living, it could be a family or a religion or a country or a political thing, where there's a gender binary. Things are either male or female, masculine or feminine, and a gender hierarchy privileging the masculine. That's patriarchy. I mean, if you want to take it literally, the word patriarchy means a rule of priests. I mean, it's a hierarchy. Hierarchy, the word hieros means priest. So it's an order that's ruled by priests. You don't have direct access to God or the truth, but you have to go through a priest. And in patriarchy, the priest is a pater, a father. That's our phone, which is, I'm sorry.
I can edit that out of the radio show.
Okay, my husband's going to turn it out, or actually. Okay. So patriarchy, the priest, the hierarchy is a pater, a father. So it privileges some men over other men, the men over the boys, the fathers over the sons, the white men over the men of color, the straight men over the gay men, and all men over women. And the contrast that we write about is between patriarchy, which is an order based on gender, and democracy, where gender is irrelevant. Because in democracy, it's the government of the people, and everyone, at least ideally, has an equal voice.
Okay. Now, Carol, you wrote this groundbreaking book over 25, about 25 or more than 25?
More, Rob.
Yeah, the early 80s, right?
The first article called In a Different Voice came out in 77, and the book came out in 82.
82, okay. So 37 years ago?
That sounds about right, yeah.
So you wrote this book In a Different Voice, and how does that, tell us a little bit about the message of it and how that ties in with this book.
Oh, it ties in. The message is very simple. I mean, if you think of the title, In a Different Voice. So there are two questions. First of all, what is the voice and what does it differ from? And the different voice is a voice that joins reason with emotion, the mind with the body, the self with relationships. And it differs from a patriarchal voice, which separates reason, masculine, from emotion, feminine, and so forth. At the time I wrote it, it was very hard. I mean, basically, the message of the book is that bringing women's voices into what's called the human conversation changes the voice of the conversation, because it brings in those human qualities that are thought of as, quote, feminine. That is, you know, emotions, the body, relationships. and joins them with what had been thought of as masculine, the self, the mind, reason, and the voice is different. And so it really, that book leads directly into what we've done, Naomi and I did together, because when you realize it, I mean, and at the time, I think it was not clear, because it was listening to women that really led me to write about a different voice. But I thought the voice was heard as a woman's voice because it was emotional and about relationships. That's still true. People think if it's emotional and about relationships, it must be a woman. But actually, it's a human voice. And so it was, here's a human voice, and it differs from a patriarchal voice. So then Naomi and I, it leads directly to our question. So if that's true, which there's a lot of evidence now in the human sciences, that as humans, we are basically relational, empathic, responsive beings, I mean, across the gender spectrum, I mean, as humans. And so why does patriarchy persist? How do we lose our connection with our feelings? How do we lose our sense of living in relationship, or even our desire to? And how do we lose the sense of our mind as being embodied, not disembodied? And yeah, go on.
Well,
now, here's where Naomi comes in.
Well, in a sense, like, if you look at the book that we wrote together in relationship to In a Different Voice, the question of our book is, what happens to the different voice? Once you recognize that it's a human voice that is neither masculine nor feminine, although, as Carol was saying, it's often read as feminine because it is more relational, more emotional. It is not the typical patriarchal idea of femininity, which is like a relational self that's selfless. It's a voice that embodies both the self and one's connection to others. And so once you recognize that that's a human voice, and it's so in tension with patriarchal constructs of masculine and femininity, then the question becomes, what happens to that voice? And in a way, that's what this book is an exploration of. What happens to the different voice? Why does it get replaced by these other ways of being and speaking?
Okay, so I want to throw a couple things in. I call the show the Bottom Up Show because I've been doing it for going on 11 years, because I think we're transitioning from a primarily top-down culture to a more bottom-up culture, a more masculine culture to a more feminine one, at least archetypally. And one of the epiphanies that I had was doing an interview with Fritjof Capra, who wrote his main original claim to fame was the Tao of Physics, kind of bridge physics and Eastern philosophy. But he wrote a book called The System's View of Life, where it really made clear to me about how we've transitioned from a linear way of doing science to a nonlinear way of doing science, more oriented towards chaos theory and systems models. And one of the biggest differences is with the linear model, you count and you measure, and with the systems model, you look at relationships and patterns. And when I was reading a synopsis of what your book was about, the Different Voice book was about, that popped into my head.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. No, I mean, that's a perfect analogy. Mm-hmm. There's a chapter in a Different Voice called Images of Relationship, and I contrast the image of hierarchy with the image of web. So that's exactly what you've been saying, and saying that the notion of hierarchy, the question is always, who's on top and who's on the bottom. Sort of where are you in the hierarchy? And the web is how close are you to the center, or how really much are you out on the edge? I mean, just the whole, it's not even an opposite, it's just it's a reconfiguration of how you look at relationships.
Now, advocates for hierarchy, not necessarily patriarchy, but hierarchy, will argue that hierarchy is common in nature and that it is valuable, like in cases of emergency, where you have a pecking order for command and things like that. And I think that it's easy to allow the argument for hierarchy in our culture because it's so deeply embedded and enmeshed in it. And I think what you're saying in your book really is that it's so wired into how we are and how we relate to each other that we've got to take a look at how it affects us way beyond hierarchy. I mean, that's what I get out of your book, is that it affects us at a very core level. There's a lot of research that's come out recently on attachment and attachment disorder and attachment theory. And really, you mentioned a little bit, you bring up Bowlby, who's into attachment. So let's talk about what the message is for this book and how it, because my summary to myself is it's about disruption of relationship and our living with that and our accepting it and buying into that as what you pay for being in a patriarchal hierarchical system.
You know, I think we would go along with you until the absolute last thing you said, and then Naomi came in, and that's why we wrote the book, with a different interpretation. And because as she started, she was taking a seminar I was teaching at NYU, and she wrote a paper that started with her writing about the death of her father when she was 5 years old, and how she had responded to that really, terrible experience of really terrible loss. And she had responded to it by, if you've had that kind of experience of loss, you're very wary about getting involved in relationships again because you've been hurt, and you don't want to, in a sense, expose yourself to being hurt again. And she asked a question which really blew my mind, which is how this whole book came about, which is, does patriarchy persist? Because in a sense, we opt to protect ourselves from the very thing we want, which is relationships or love, out of being basically afraid of what would happen if we really opened ourselves to relationships and love. So does patriarchy persist? In part because it serves a psychological function, a defensive function.
And I think just maybe to link that back to kind of a question, Rob, that you asked just a moment ago of like, in some circumstances, we feel like hierarchy is a kind of safer kind of option and protective, and the kind of more chaotic, undefined nature of a more relational approach feels dangerous. And I think in a way that's our book kind of speaks to how in some circumstances that can feel like the truth. Kind of following the death of my father, I learned that relationships can be incredibly kind of risky, and they can be really dangerous. So actually it can feel very protective to have a more kind of rigid, detached way of being in the world. That can feel protective. What we kind of try and show in the book is that what feels protective is actually kind of I don't want to use too much jargon, but it's pathological. It feels protective, and in some circumstances it is. But really, what it gets in the way of is kind of something so much more healthy, which is finding a way to be in relationship with others while negotiating with them some of those risks and dangers versus withdrawing completely. I mean, to make it really concrete, I feel like I'm seeing that right in the moment with Brexit. Like, I think a lot of the people thought withdrawing from the EU was this way of like bringing back control to Britain, and kind of like, and what you see is actually it's a myth. We're interdependent, so kind of withdrawal can feel protective, but it kind of has manifest follow-up implications. Like, I wasn't happy by responding to my father's death in that way. It felt protective. It was also, I was in a lot of therapy as well. Like it wasn't how I wanted to be in the world, if that makes sense.
But I'm not clear exactly what I got wrong when I gave my attempt at a summary. And I'm not arguing. I just want to understand better. What part did I miss?
to me, it was, I was with you until the very last thing you said now. I'm
blanking on what it was.
Okay, so one of the things that's clear, though, is that patriarchy is bad for men, too.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
How talk about that. How does patriarchy hurt men?
Oh, that's all over the news right now. The American Psychological Association just came out with a big article about how patriarchal masculinity, which means to be a man means to be superior. It means to be at the top of the hierarchy. And it means to be independent, not to have to depend on other people. That's sort of babyish to have to do that. And that is, in fact, very costly for men. And that psychologists have to help men to resist that kind of masculinity because it's so costly to themselves. And then there was this article in the Times.
How is it costly to men?
Oh, because I think they lose touch with their emotions. Mm-hmm. They can't think about what they're feeling. They also feel that to be a man means you don't need relationships. And so they become isolated. And there's study after study now, Rob, that shows that literally if you don't have close relationships, including close relationships beyond your lover or spouse or something, you're much more at risk for disease, for dying, for so forth. I mean, it's really, it's more devastating to your health than smoking, or as devastating or something. And that was really surprising because people thought that being able to stand on your own 2 feet and not having to depend on anybody else, that was the mark of maturity. And now it's seen as actually, no, it's a risk factor. So people get asked, how many relationships do you have in your life?
And I think that in our way, our book really, really kind of speaks to this and adds as an extra layer to that research, because what our book shows is that we came to this discovery that what's been seen as patriarchal masculinity, actually, just to link it back to the relationship with attachment, is that what's been seen as patriarchal masculinity, this kind of more what was autonomous but sort of a level of emotional and relational detachment, really, really mirrors what psychologists have for a long time seen as a maladaptive, a pathological form of attachment, which is sort of avoidant attachment. And that even though that has a defensive function in some kind of very sort of disrupted environments, over the long term, what it means is people become incredibly, like Carol was saying, emotionally withdrawn, physically isolated, and that leads to all sorts of psychological problems. I mean, you just need to look at the kind of rates. I think in the UK, suicide is the largest killer or second largest killer of men between the ages of 18 and 25. I forget the statistics, but it's shocking. And I think a lot of that is to do with the fact that to speak about your vulnerability and your emotions is incredibly shameful under kind of ideals of patriarchal masculinity. So you bottle up feelings. And
now you in the book talk a lot about connection and disconnection and where this ties in, and you give us an example, a very powerful brief video that of an experiment, that example that a psychologist gave of a mother and a child. And I can't put it on this interview, but if you go to bit.ly/baby disrupted, all lowercase, I set that up so it's an easy way to find it.
Oh, great.
It's such a powerful video. And basically it shows where they had a mother and a baby, a year old, are interacting beautifully with love and connection. And then the psychologist snaps his finger and basically says, stop responding. And she does that, and the baby tries to get her attention and smiles and laughs and plays and points, and nothing works, and the baby ends up tearful and upset and distraught. And then she snaps the finger again, and the mother goes back, and they recover from this, what you describe as a rupture. So how does this fit into what you're talking about here?
Well, I mean, this was what was so illuminating to me, which was to realize that really across the human sciences now, whether you're talking about neuroscience or developmental psychology or these studies of babies and so forth, there's really a consensus that we start out as human beings very really tuned into the environment around us, including the human environment. So the baby knows immediately when the mother stops responding. And as you just exactly what you described, Rob. So if I want to set up a hierarchy, if I want to say that some human beings are superior to others, whether on the basis of race or class or caste or religion, whatever, or if I want to say that some people deserve to have a lot of money and some people, and so forth, these relational capacities of humans are going to get in the way, because the person who's on the top is going to pick up the feelings of the person on the bottom. And the person on the bottom is going to express how they feel about being on the bottom. So if you want to maintain these hierarchies, whether it's on the basis of race or sex or gender or sexuality, it doesn't matter. You have to stunt these relational qualities. You've got to go after them and blunt them. And, honestly, it's almost so clever you think somebody probably planned it. But what happens is it's in the name of becoming a man, a real man, or a good woman, that the culture goes after, the culture of patriarchy goes after the very qualities that enable us to repair ruptures in relationship.
And you talk in the book about manhood and womanhood.
That's right, exactly. And what we talk about specifically is when manhood and womanhood are defined in terms of a gender binary and hierarchy. So being a man means not being a woman or like a woman, meaning not being girly or gay or having any of those emotions or qualities or whatever.
Or just being emotionally expressive.
Exactly. And, part of the work on the developmental work is the work that I did with my students at Harvard. First, the studies of girls, and then the studies as they reach adolescence, and then the studies of little boys, the 4 and 5-year-olds that I did with Judy Chu. And she wrote this wonderful book called When Boys Become, quote, Boys, of showing how emotionally open and expressive and really shrewd these little boys are. And then they're told, look, if you want to be one of the boys, you've got to cover up that because those are girls' qualities.
It's almost like the still-faced mother experiment kind of gives this like 2-minute window in like a very concrete way into like the mechanism by which patriarchy kind of perpetuates itself. So like in the video you see how the non-responsiveness of the mother to the baby's attempts to restore connection eventually results in the baby's withdrawal. And kind of what Carol's research shows is that once so like at the point of initiation into patriarchy, it's almost like the culture becomes the still-faced mother to that emotional boy. The attempts to repair connections, to kind of to maintain ongoing relationships, are met with like a kind of stony still face, or worse, like stop being such a sissy, stop being such a baby, be a man. And so those attempts to repair a connection instead become a threat to connection. And so you see the kind of sort of like emotional withdrawals that you see in that 2-minute video.
Now I want to take a pause. Need to do a show ID now, and we'll just pause for the radio. And my guests for this show are Carol Gilligan and Naomi Snider, the authors of Why Does Patriarchy Persist? Carol Gilligan is a writer, activist, New York University professor, and the author of In a Different Voice, one of the most influential feminist books of all time. Naomi Snider is a research fellow at NYU and founder of NYU's Radical Listening Project, which I want to get a chance to hear about a little later on. In referring to these little boys going from pre-kindergarten to kindergarten to first grade, you describe in the book about how part of that process of becoming boys is the suppression of empathy, the hiding of vulnerability. This is pathological. And it also happens to girls too. It's not just boys.
Right.
It's kind of the inverse what happens to girls. You see this repression of them, like their capacity to assert themselves. So they're encouraged to be empathic to others, and vulnerability is kind of lauded, but to be more assertive is shamed, and to be in touch with their own desires is also shamed.
I mean, we're seeing that right now with these the women who are in the House of Representatives now, these new young women, and they're like the girls. They're like the girls in my study. I mean, they say what they feel and think, and they don't just pull back and so forth. And everybody thinks, wow. And then the question is, are you going to criticize them? And I loved it when Nancy Pelosi said about the woman who talked about, talking with her son about bullying and the president and so forth. And, instead of criticizing her, Nancy Pelosi said, well, my generation doesn't talk like this, when she used the MF word, but, that's how people talk. And I'm not into, policing how other women talk. And anyway, she wasn't hurting anybody by saying that.
Yeah.
And I thought everyone was surprised because we thought those women were going to be criticized. I think that's the representative from Detroit. And then there's Ocasio-Cortez, and when she did the dance, and everybody was saying, "Oh, you shouldn't do that dance," and so forth and so on. And she said, "Well, why not?" And then she did this dance outside her office, and it went viral, and people said it was great. She was terrific, but there was a sense of something that we were expecting to happen didn't happen.
Just to contrast that with when I went back to London over Christmas, I was really taken aback by and it's especially the tabloids there, but the attitude they have to Meghan Markle is so atrocious, and it's kind of the complete opposite. This woman who's sort of quite, especially for someone that wants to be part of the royal family, quite assertive, a little more outspoken, a self-identified feminist,
and a woman of color.
And and I think that's probably the biggest silent kind of threat that she poses to kind of the establishment. But the kind of the stories that go on about her of she's a battle axe, she's stories of how she's so and so quit because she's awful, she's in, and probably I imagine made up stories about this supposed rivalry between her and the Duchess of Cambridge, and you think it's purely just because this is a kind of slightly more outspoken woman that can't be tolerated.
I have hope. I have hope that we're transitioning to a more bottom-up culture, a culture
Absolutely.
that is more embracing of the feminine, more open to, and that we've got generations coming in whose brains work differently, who see the world differently.
Well, and who are resistors, because I was mentioning there's this group of men who are radicals, who were saying just what you're saying. I mean, these qualities.
Well, wait. You need it. Now, you talk a lot about resistance in the book and resistors. So I think you should define what you mean by resistor.
Mm. Oh, okay. That there's a force in the culture, and we call this force patriarchy. That, as I said, would really would impose this gender binary hierarchy and stunt human capacities in everybody across the gender spectrum. And the thing is that as humans, we resist this loss of our human capacities. So I use resistance. I love the word resistance. And the reason I love it is because I use it in all three meanings of the word, which I want, which is, first of all, we talk about the body's immune system, that a healthy body resists infection. In other words, a healthy body has the capacity to resist, to fight off infection. And I would say a healthy psyche has the capacity to resist pressures from a culture that would basically stunt vital human capacities, which is these capacities that allow us to live in touch with ourselves, with our own thoughts and feelings, and other people, and therefore basically to engage with other people to solve really the very challenging human problems we face at this moment in our collective history. And I think I agree with you, Rob. I'm feeling hopeful that both men and women are now coming to what was seen as a resistance that was criticized. That's why I mentioned these young congresswomen, and also Nancy Pelosi, by the way, that she's resisting what, in fact, women have been under huge pressure to basically accede to. And
you mentioned three kinds of resistance, and you only described two.
Okay, so I talked about, first of all, the healthy resistance, like the immune system. Political resistance is speaking truth to power. That's political resistance.
Okay.
And psychological resistance is the reluctance to know what one is really feeling and thinking. And what we said is the initiation into patriarchy leaves men with a reluctance to know that as humans, they are vulnerable. And also as humans, they have feelings of, tenderness and sadness, feelings that feel not quite masculine. And for women, the resistance to know that, in fact, most women do have access to the voice that says what they're really feeling and thinking, but they are under pressure to silence that voice. There's a girl in one of my studies, her name, I think we call her Niti. She was of Asian Indian descent, and she was a school leader, an outstanding student. And she said, and this is a quote, "The voice that stands up for what I believe in has been buried deep inside me." And I thought, wow, because she's not saying it was lost. She's saying it was buried inside her. So then my question is always, it's there. That voice is there in every woman, just as I believe that emotionally intelligent 4-year-old, that shrewdly emotionally perceptive 4-year-old boy is in every man. So I'm always thinking, where's that voice? Where's the emotionally intelligent voice in a man? And where is the honest, perceptive voice in a woman?
The other thing that reading your book and have this conversation makes me think about is authoritarianism. And most people who are authoritarian are the ones who say, please tell me what to do. They're not the ones who tell people what to do. 99.9% of them are the ones who need to submit to authoritarian personalities. Where does authoritarianism fit in with patriarchy?
Well, if you have to not know what you're feeling, or if you're cut off from your own basic human capacities, then you need someone else to tell you.
So it's an integral part, really. Somebody in a patriarchal system needs somebody, an authoritarian person, to tell them what to feel and what to think. Wow.
I mean, if you think about the women's movement. I mean, think about second wave feminism. And it's women, as women, we were told, you don't really know what you want. You need some man to tell you what you want. You don't really know what you think. You need some authority to tell you what you think. And the second wave feminism was tremendously about voice, about women really accessing, wait a minute, I do have a voice. Not just a voice that speaks for other people, but a voice that also speaks for myself. And you look at literature and films and so forth, and you realize that across time and across cultures, there are all these girls, these 10-year-olds, whether it's Jane Eyre in Charlotte Bronte's novel, and her Aunt Reed accuses her of being a liar. And this 10-year-old Jane says, it's in the book, she says, if I were a liar, I would say I love you and I don't. You think, wait a minute. And then you see the film Wajda, which is the first full-length feature film to come out of Saudi Arabia, where women can't drive and girls can't ride bicycles, at least until recently. And here's this 10-year-old, and she wants a bicycle. And in the film, she gets one. So you think, wait a minute, that voice is there. That voice is accessible.
So, in a sense, women in patriarchy, their voices to stand up for themselves, to stand up to the system, are squelched. For men, their voices of expression of emotion and feeling and relationship are squelched.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And it's this squelching, this I don't remember who said it, but it's like a circumcision of the heart, really.
Wow.
That is what happens under patriarchy. That is at the core, that you use to explain why it's still here. That it's not just a political thing; it's a core part of who we are that evolves and develops, like when little toddlers become little boys. It's that central.
Yeah, and it sets in motion a psychology which then keeps it in place. So there's this kind of pernicious relationship between the social and the psychological.
So what are your solutions? What do you offer?
Well, I was going to say, but we also say, but the human being, the human psyche, if you like, the human soul resist the loss of human capacities. So there is always resistance. And so and what I think we're seeing right now, in some ways, this is playing out so starkly in our culture right now, where we see both this resurgence of patriarchy. We have this president he's like the embodiment of patriarchy. I am the authority. If I say it, it's true. Why is it true? Because I say it, and I was the winner. I was on top. All of this. And then we have this resistance.
I think the fact that these two things are going hand in hand is really no coincidence, because kind of the other side of the coin is that each time you're faced again with the loss that patriarchy inflicts, there's new opportunity for a healthy resistance. And to make this so concrete, I really, really saw this after the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. So as I was explaining earlier, I'm just starting training to become an analyst, and I went in the next day and I was feeling so sort of disheartened, sense of real despair, and I kind of knew this is he's gonna, despite what we saw yesterday, he's gonna get approved. And what really
you broke up. You were referring to the Kavanaugh hearing.
The Kavanaugh hearings. And what was so I can't think of the right word, but what gave me so much hope was the number of female patients that came in, some of whom I've never heard like them express anger at all. So angry, speaking about past harms that they've never mentioned before, and a kind of it galvanized something that was otherwise not there. And I think that's what we're seeing politically. We're seeing so many more women coming out, and men as well, coming out and joining forces to resist something that they're recognizing as harmful and has always been harmful. So I think that's incredibly hopeful. Good.
We need hope.
Yeah.
We need to make this change. So, need to do another brief show ID, and then we're going to talk about some myths, because you bring up a couple myths that I think are interesting, and I love myths. My guests for this show are Carol Gilligan and Naomi Snider, co-authors of the book, Why Does Patriarchy Persist? Carol Gilligan is a writer, activist, NYU professor, and the author of In a Different Voice, one of the most influential feminist books of all time. Naomi Snider is a research fellow at NYU and founder of NYU's Radical Listening Project. So you mention in the book two different myths. You mention Oedipus and you mention Psyche, Eros, and Venus. So put that together, please.
Well, I mean, we mentioned that when we first were developing the ideas of this book, we wrote a paper called The Loss of Pleasure. We were thinking about, for example, the film you described, about one of the things is when that little baby loses touch with her mother, and you can see pleasure just drain from her body and face. So we wrote a paper called The Loss of Pleasure, that when you lose relationship, you lose pleasure. The Loss of Pleasure, or Why We Are Still Talking About Oedipus. That was our title. And what we said is that the Oedipus myth, I mean, if you read the myth, it's a story about basically male violence and female silence. I mean, you know, in the play, Oedipus Tyrannos, Jocasta, the mother wife of Oedipus, I mean, the chorus says about her, how could that queen whom Laius won be silent when that deed was done? How did she exceed in this father's willingness basically to sacrifice his child? In other words, because there was this prophecy that because he had abused a child, this father, Laius, that a son of his own would come and he would exact retribution for what the father had done. So the father thinks, I'm going to protect myself by abandoning the son. And the mother enacts it with him. So basically, why is she acting like a patriarchal woman, being silent, having no voice of her own? And why is he trying to basically, wound and abandon his son? I mean, that's what that myth is about. And
in a sense, really, patriarchy emasculates, takes away the full personhood of every man.
Totally, completely, exactly.
But it's also really interesting because in a way, because Oedipus has had such a strong kind of role within psychoanalysis, it was kind of read as a kind of universal story about how patriarchy is built into our nature. So that kind of desire of Oedipus to kill his father, to replace the patriarch and become the patriarch, that natural desire for hierarchy and authority was, and the woman's silence within that was just read as natural. And kind of what we show in the book is, like, in fact, what that myth shows, because at the beginning it's a trauma story. It doesn't just occur out of nowhere. You see that the king abandons his son Oedipus. So in fact, there's this loss of attachment right at the beginning of that myth that's written in there, but no one saw it, that what was seen as natural was in fact kind of a result of the cycle of trauma. So just a side note to add.
Yeah, and I wanted, in my book, The Birth of Pleasure, I said that we also have a resistance myth, and that's the myth of Psyche and Cupid. And the thing I read, the myth of Psyche and Cupid gives you a map of how to get out of the Oedipus tragedy. That instead of the sort of Oedipus triangle of father, mother, and son, it has a different configuration of a young woman, Psyche, the name means soul, her lover, Eros, name means love, and his mother. So if you want, here's a configuration that will show a way out. And it points to a girl reaching adolescence has to resist allowing herself to be turned into an object rather than a person. And that's the first point of resistance. And secondly, she has to resist a bargain that in the myth Eros makes with her, that he will basically be her lover and be with her if she never speaks about her experience with him and never tries to see him. Because in the daytime, in his public persona, he's Cupid, the naughty boy with the arrows. So he can't be revealed as who in fact he is to Psyche, which is a very tender and responsive lover.
Wow.
And so that Psyche has to resist the pressure on her to become an object, and Eros has to resist the pressure on him to hide his tenderness and his love. And so they both basically have to resist what we describe as the initiation, of children into a patriarchal society. And the myth of Psyche and Cupid ends with the birth of a daughter named Pleasure. And it's like, how can a man and woman get out of a story that's going to lead to tragedies, that's going to lead to murder and incest and violence and so forth, and death, and instead have a story that leads to pleasure? And so we said, it's amazing, because in the myth of Cupid and Psyche, we have a map of resistance, that women have to resist becoming objectified, even though they're told, you'll be worshipped and so forth and so on. And women have to resist the pressures on them to not say and see what we know from our own experience about love and about men. And then men have to come into relationship with their own true feelings. I mean, there's a wonderful place in the myth where Cupid leaves Psyche because she broke his prohibition on seeing him and speaking about their relationship, and he goes back to his mother. And then it says he misses Psyche. In other words, he had confused her maybe with his mother, but actually he missed her and he knew who she was. I mean, it's a very shrewd myth. So he goes to find her. And what he recognizes is, oh, here's Psyche. And she had disobeyed another prohibition that was up. And he says, here's Psyche with her overmuch curiosity. This is a woman driven by curiosity. And the myth says, and he loved her more and more. I mean, seeing who she was and knowing who she was. So it's really a myth about how to get out of the Oedipus tragedy. And Naomi and I read this is also how to get out of a patriarchal story, which is going to stand in the way not only of democracy on a political level, but also our human desire to basically engage with ourselves and other people in a real way. Our desire to love and be loved, to be seen, to be known.
You talk in the book about how patriarchy is inconsistent with democracy. Talk about that.
The opposite, yeah. Oh, because patriarchy is based on privileging the voices of, basically the voice of the father, or the voices of the fathers. It's a hierarchy where some men are, I mean, you can just see it. Oh my God, it's in our culture right now. It's in the white supremacists. White men are superior to men of color, straight men are superior to gay men, Christian men are superior to Muslim or Jewish, or Americans to Mexicans. This whole thing about that. Democracy depends on equal voice, because it's only when everyone has a voice, and a voice that is connected with their own experience, that we can resolve conflicts, which are inevitable in relationships, rather than through the use of force.
Talk about democracy and connection. I'm very interested in connection. I think that and you get into it a lot. So
yeah. Oh, democracy depends on connection, because in democracy, you have to work in connection with other people. I mean, look at our government shutdown right now. I mean, and people are saying, you have to work, our president has to work in connection with Congress. They have to work together to work out some understanding of what really constitutes border security. And the president says, I don't work in connection, my way or the highway. That's the patriarchal. And Congress, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer says, I'm sorry, no, we work in connection. Let's start the government. People are suffering. There's real suffering going on among people, and also danger. I mean, what about air safety and the safety of food, blah, blah, blah. And then we will work out. We will meet together and talk to. That's how a democracy works. Trump says basically, I don't care for democracy. If I give in to you, people will laugh at me.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, honestly, Rob, it's amazing, because we wrote this book, and now it's like seeing our book playing out, in Technicolor, in 3 dimensions, in front of
Naomi, you're working to become a psychotherapist.
Yeah.
Where does patriarchy fit into the role of impairing people's full nature? How does it prevent them from becoming fully healthy and from a psychological point of view?
Well, I think that's what we've been speaking about. It shames certain parts of the self. So I see in so many of my female patients a kind of a confusion of what it is that they really want, a real difficulty in locating that. And so even though it's not, I mean, and these are lawyers, these are actresses, these are feminists, you know, they're not like 1950s housewives, but very often in their relationships they will speak of a sense of guilt over doing what they really, really want to do, saying what they really think. Like very often the therapy room will become a place where they can admit to feelings that on the outside they think will be perceived as aggressive, selfish. And then with some of my male patients, it's kind of the inverse. They feel an incredible pressure to be sort of stoic, providers, certain, you know, all the things that we've been talking about, and it's really difficult to access those, to have a more integrated sense of self, despite rationally not believing in these things.
Another concept that you bring out in the book is oppression. And really, patriarchy oppresses people and their feelings and their connections. So talk a little bit about, you mentioned in the book, oppression and relational capacity.
Well, basically, we're born with the rudiments of relational capacity. We're born with a voice. Even before we have language, we can communicate what it is we're feeling. I mean, a baby cries if it's uncomfortable, or baby laughs if it's happy. And so we can communicate our feelings, and we also are born with the capacity and the desire to engage responsively with other people. It's in that video you described. I mean, I'm so glad you're making that.
And the video is bit.ly/baby disrupted, all lowercase.
And so, you know, we're born with these relational capacities and the desire to have a voice and to engage with other people.
And oppression?
Well, oppression is basically to say, you know, that for this reason, you know, to oppress, a greater force comes in and says, I'm sorry, you know, you can't do this because it will threaten this order that we want to maintain.
I think also what's interesting that the book shows is that the way that oppression can sometimes play out. Like 51% of white women voted for Trump. There's a level of complicity with oppression, and I think what we're talking about is the way that in order for that to happen, you need some disruption of these relational capacities.
The 51% are the Jocastas of the world.
Correct. But
you know, it happens in our most intimate relationships as well, like in contexts that you just wouldn't think as patriarchal, but like friends, patients, whatever, like that go along with things in relationships that on some level they don't really want to do, but they want to keep the relationships, and maybe actually they do really want to do it. Like you see it I see it in myself very often. You don't just have to look far away at the Jocastas that voted for Trump to see it. I think it's a lot closer to home than many of us would like to think.
You know, when I think about the Oedipal story,
mm-hmm.
It's part of my way of thinking about the Oedipal thing is it's the process of a young man coming of age and going through individuation and dealing with his relationship with his father and growing up and taking his own power. And the story of Oedipus is one where if you try to do that, if you challenge the patriarchy, if you challenge the power, you're going to destroy your life. That's the message of Oedipus in some ways.
Well, I think it sets it kind of sets that idea of like, that's the path to individuation, that the way to become your true self is to kill your father. And I think that's how kind of we've often read development, and what the psyche myth shows is, no, that there's another way to be in the world as an adult. It's not just, you don't have to kill your father to claim power, or in the case of psyche, you don't have to become you don't have to replace Venus to become the new woman. That there's a way in which having continuing relationships, there's a way in which we can share power. It's not a zero-sum game.
I'll throw in my favorite myth is the hero's journey that Joseph Campbell described, and before that, which was called the monomyth. And in the hero's journey, essential elements, once you've crossed the threshold, is you've got to have an apotheosis, which is a reassessment of your relationship with whatever higher power you have. You have to have a meeting with the goddess and a meeting with the father, in which you reevaluate your relationship with your masculinity and your femininity. And I think this is also another way that it's possible to become a hero or a shiro or a heroine, and to be able to become a new person who is able to stand up to the authoritarian hierarchical system that is usually part of what a hero does. What do you think? It's off the top of my head. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I mean, I've never.
I love the part about that. Basically, you have to come to terms with, I guess the way I would put it, what the culture describes as your masculine, what you think of as masculinity and femininity, but these different parts of yourself.
Yeah.
And integrate them. And I think that's absolutely true. I agree with you.
So we've got to wrap in a minute, but I wanted to get a picture. Naomi, what is Radical Listening Project?
So that's actually something that Carol and I and a few other researchers at NYU established. And it's basically focused on using the listening guide, which is, and Carol will probably be able to explain this much better than me, but it's a method of qualitative research, which actually was
Wait, let's wait till that stops. Okay. Describe it.
Take that in another room, please.
Okay.
I mean, I wonder if, Carol, you're going to do a better job of describing the listening guide, but what I will say is it's a method of listening that was central to all of Carol's discoveries, from In a Different Voice through to her research on girls. And what's so important about it is it's a way of listening that listens to a multiplicity of voices. So that includes not just kind of the surface level, maybe culturally approved voice, but voices that resist that speak against it. And so, but what the listening, the Radical Listening Project, well, to say also, it's radical listening because it's listening that goes to the roots of what is said. So it's radical in that sense, but it's also radical in the sense that listening has the possibility of changing the conversation, which, to go back where we began, was, Carol's initial research showed that by listening to women's voices, the conversation on morality shifted. So our thinking is around how listening is not just, and listening in this way is not simply a tool for research, but for shifting our way of conducting political conversations.
So how is radical listening different? Carol?
Carol.
Well, think about the word radical. I mean, it means, as Naomi said, it means going to the root. So you listen. I listen to a conversation and I ask myself, where is this conversation rooted? Where is this conversation coming from? Who is speaking and to whom? And in what physical space or what body? And telling what stories about which relationships in what societal and cultural frameworks. It's almost like a GPS. I listen, how do I locate what I'm hearing? And then I thought, I can illustrate it with a small little anecdote about a young boy, which is one of the 4-year-olds in our study of boys. I mean, he looked at his mother, and he said, Mama, why do you smile when you're sad? Now, if you think about this is a 4-year-old, and he's saying that she's smiling, but he's reading the feeling that's behind that. He's reading the sadness which she's covering by smiling. Now, radical listening also listens not only for what's being said, but for what's not being said, for the conversation behind the conversation. And why? And Naomi said it, because it's also listening that seeks to basically has the potential for transforming something. So if I'm really listening to you, I have to open myself that taking in, your experience, your worldview and so forth could change me, could change my worldview. And if I'm really listening, I open myself to that possibility. And then the conversation could go somewhere where neither you or I imagined before we started talking to each other. So it's listening that goes to the root, and listening that's radical in the sense that it has the possibility for transformation and therefore for change, whether it's psychological change or political change or both. And that's really why we wrote our book, because we thought we'd come to understand what stood in the way of people, and trying to change in ways that they want to change. That's what Naomi was describing. I mean, she wanted a certain kind of relationship, but something was standing in her way. Or we could say, as a country, we say we want a democratic society. What's standing in our way? I mean, how come we perpetuate these forms of injustice or oppression? And our book really, first of all, begins to explain, gives a way of understanding how come, but also shows how we can change this, how we can transform it. So I think of it as basically a very hopeful book. I mean, to say we have this capacity within ourselves.
I think it is hopeful. I think that we are moving in that direction. We've got to wrap. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was a pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah.
My guests for this show have been Carol Gilligan and Naomi Snider, the authors of Why Does Patriarchy Persist?